We need real, bipartisan, set-in-stone Magna Carta energy policy.
Who in Congress really understands about maintaining frequency and voltage? We really do need to actually take politics out of it.
The solutions are different. Like, there's no silver bullet for it, and so you need a little bit of all of the above.
A simple ChatGPT search takes about 10 times as much power as a simple Google search.
The industry can accommodate to whatever the policies are and find the biggest solution, but we kind of need that visibility and that certainty.
Hello and welcome to The Energy Gang, a discussion show from Wood Mackenzie about the fast-changing world of energy. I'm Ed Crooks. I'm welcoming you now to a special edition of The Energy Gang, recorded live in front of an invited audience at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. Hello everyone in the audience today. We're going to be talking about the reliability and resilience of the US energy system and about the grid in particular. Very pressing subject at the moment in particular, I think, because of everything we've been talking about in terms of rapid growth in electricity demand in the United States, mostly because of AI, and also because of new tensions, strains on the grid that have been created by changes in the generation mix, retirement of a lot of old generation, addition of a lot of new generation, which in recent years has been very largely wind and solar being added to the grid, and that's creating a lot of new issues, and that's really what we're going to be talking about today. To do that, it's a great pleasure to welcome my old friend from the Energy Gang, Amy Myers Jaffe, who's Director of the Energy, Climate Justice and Sustainability Lab at NYU. Hi, Amy, how are you?
I'm great, Ed. Great to be launching off New York City Climate Week here at the Council of Foreign Relations.
Absolutely, yeah, great place to be doing it. It's also a great pleasure to welcome Neil Chatterjee. Neil is one of the big names, I think it's fair to say, in US energy policy, had a number of different roles. You were previously chairman of FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and now you're wearing a number of different hats, aren't you?
Number of different hats, most significantly, Energy Gang podcast participant. I'm also the Chief Government Affairs Officer at Palmetto, a clean tech company, industry advisor at KKR, doing due diligence in the energy space. I'm on a number of boards, and I may be breaking news here. I'm soon to be a distinguished visiting fellow at Columbia. So the singular throughput through all of my professional activities is that I'm a conservative who cares about decarbonization with an emphasis on maintaining reliability and affordability, which I think will undergird our conversation today. I'm very much looking forward to it.
Yeah, well, thanks very much for joining us today. Great to have you here. And it's also a pleasure to welcome to the Energy Gang for the first time, Cecilio Velasco, who is a Managing Director for Infrastructure at KKR, of course, one of the world's biggest investment firms. Cecilio, thanks very much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Ed, for having me. It's a pleasure, and look forward to comparing notes here with this group around the Ed topic at hand.
Neil, I wonder if I could start with you, perhaps, to kind of frame things for us and to talk a little bit about your view of this issue. When you think about reliability of the grid, resilience of the grid to shocks and disturbances, what are the key issues as you see it?
Yeah, so look, this was, I felt my singular focus during my tenure as a commissioner and chairman of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. I think while the commission has vast responsibilities, in my view, our foremost obligation, the one that my colleagues and I had, was to ensure that when Americans hit the switch, that the lights come on. But this is an exercise that, quite frankly, many of us take for granted. And it is one that used to be oversought primarily by engineers and economists. And over the course of time, particularly over maybe the last 2 decades, when we in the US have been the beneficiaries of relatively flat demand for electricity, what we've seen is increasingly politics has started to infect this discussion around really complex, nuanced, wonky technical things like resource adequacy. And we really struggled with it during my time at the commission, and I, for one, bear some responsibility for it. When I first was seated at the commission, I had just spent nearly a decade as energy policy advisor to my home state senator, Senator Mitch McConnell of Kentucky, where I worked very closely on behalf of his constituents, who largely represented coal interests in Kentucky. And very early on in my tenure, we were presented with a notice of proposed rulemaking from then Secretary of Energy Rick Perry that sought to compensate certain forms of baseload power, namely coal plants and nuclear plants, who had the attribute of having on-site fuel, 90-day supply of fuel. And I'll be honest, I handled this very poorly. I think Secretary Perry raised a serious question about reliability and the resilience of the grid. But I handled it the way that a politician would, not the way an independent regulator should. And in doing so, I think I started a period to where, politics really, unfortunately, impacted in a negative way this broader question around resource adequacy and reliability and resilience. Even the very term resilience, some people call it resilience, some people call it resiliency, and your politics can be borne out in how you even pronounce the word. And I wrestled with it during my time as chair of FERC in the first Trump administration, where we looked at things like the minimum offer price rule in the PJM capacity market, which we could get to. I thought my successors in the Biden administration went the other way and took steps to, in my view, artificially suppress capacity prices to accelerate the retirement of their sources of negative generation and to proffer up their preferred sources of generation. And I published an op-ed in Fox last week where I expressed frustration with both administrations. I thought the first Trump administration was wrong to try and artificially impact markets to drive their preferred sources. I thought Biden made the same mistake, and now I think Trump 2.0 is making the same mistake again, but just from different fuel sources. The reality is, and we're going to talk about it, and I don't mean to monopolize the time, but I think not just demand being driven by AI and data centers necessary to support AI, but everything from streaming services to cloud computing and quantum computing, vehicle electrification, building electrification, crypto and Bitcoin mining, a reshoring of manufacturing in this country. All of these things are energy intense endeavors that are going to have to cause us to rethink our approach to resource adequacy and meeting this supply-demand imbalance. And to me, I want to take the politics out of it. I genuinely believe we need every available electron. And so for the political left, I think that means coming to terms with the reality that in order to meet this coming surge in demand while maintaining reliability and affordability, we're going to need fossil fuels, particularly natural gas, for the foreseeable future, which is going to mean more natural gas plants coming online and more natural gas pipelines being built. But it also means for the political right that we have to become aware of the fact that we cannot possibly win the AI race, meet this coming surge in demand, and maintain affordability and reliability with fossil fuels alone. That not only are we going to need solar and storage and geothermal and nuclear and wind, but we're also going to need megawatts. Things like demand response and virtual power plants, grid enhancing technologies that can squeeze maximum efficiency out of our existing infrastructure, increased deployment of distributed energy resources. These are all going to be critical. And so Amy and I were on a podcast earlier today where I joked, she wrote a book. I'm not smart enough to write a book, but if I could get a tattoo somewhere on my body, if I didn't have such limited pain threshold tolerance, my tattoo would say solar plus storage with gas peakers to balance the grid and investing in alternative technologies. It's not that hard. We just got to get the politics out of it. Thank you for listening to my TED Talk.
Very good. It's still quite a lot to get tattooed on you, I think, but still, even that much. So I'm very interested. I want to come back to questions about the current administration and what they're doing. Just before we do, though, I just want to be clear about when you say you think you handled the first Trump administration wrongly, or some of the energy policy moves under the first Trump administration. What did you do wrong, and what in hindsight do you think you should have done differently?
It's simple. Should have kept my mouth shut. The problems that I created within the markets and within stakeholders who observe the commission and the markets it oversees is I was opining the way a politician would opine about what the commission may or may not do in regards to the specific policy. And it was having a direct market impact. People were making decisions based on the thought that, oh my God, this maniac may actually adopt this policy. And ultimately, I voted with my colleagues unanimously to find that what was being proposed was not legally viable. But because I talked about it, it kind of screwed things up. I learned my lesson, and a couple of years later, there was a petition regarding net metering, about nationalizing kind of net metering in policy in the US that would have been very hostile to solar energy. And a lot of people assumed, because of the political demeanor I had sort of adopted at the commission, that I might have been sympathetic to this very hostile clean energy provision. And when we dismissed it 4-0 and rejected it, people were surprised, and it has a positive market impact. But the lesson I learned from my first exercise to that one, I kept my mouth shut the second time.
Well, it's nice, obviously, to have left FERC now and to be able to talk as much as you want.
Yeah, much easier now. So
yeah, indeed.
Much better for podcasts.
Yeah. Amy, so what's your take then on this issue of reliability, resilience on the grid? Where do you stand on what the issues are, what the key trends are, and what the administration is doing about them?
Well, listen, I'm going to second Neil and up him in the sense that, I'm a university professor. People do, power engineering modeling. We just have a new FERC order that all transmission planning processes need to be 20 years and need to be very forward-looking, need to do scenarios. One of the scenarios needs to look at extreme weather, which is vitally important at this point. So to that point, I actually have a group of students, graduate students at NYU, who've been fooling around with the different data. We've been improving the data set on virtual power plants and where they're going in the United States. We just downloaded and started manipulating all the outage data for the entire United States for the past decade. And we've only done the annualized data first, so obviously the monthly data is going to be very different, and state by state it's going to be very different. But when we compared PJM with CAISO, California. PJM, by the way, is sort of like the mid-Atlantic and the center of the country. So we're talking like the Ohios, the Pennsylvanias, et cetera. And when you, and we also compared it to ERCOT, which is Texas. And the outage data for Texas is, pretty flat. And then there's this giant spike during Hurricane Uri. And the California data is surprisingly flat, but with a slight uphill climb. But the PJM data, outage data, is 3 to 4 to 5 times higher over the entire period and increasing, which shocked me because we hear a lot of talk about California's failing because of the fires and the bankruptcy of PG&E, the main utility for Northern California. We all have seen the whole giant, as Neil's alluding to, publicized political debate about Texas. But our real problem in the country is in PJM, and that is where the most data centers are. And let me tell you another little factoid, not to be partisan. It is where the highest concentration of natural gas peaking plants is. So when people tell you that there's a technology solution and it's for the whole country, that's clearly not right, because here you have a place in the United States that has more natural gas peakers than anywhere else. And they have the highest outage rate compared to places that have successfully deployed batteries. Texas is the largest market now in the United States for battery storage deployment. And NRG, the big utility down there, has literally just announced a 1 gigawatt virtual power plant. So, I agree there are going to be places where we have to use different fuels because of the nature of what's there and the nature of where we need to go and how much it's growing and so forth. But, you know me, Ed, I'm like a broken record, on the battery thing. And that's a challenge because we have to keep our investment in R&D and manufacturing for batteries in this country. And, we can't afford to have that be a political question.
So, Cecilio, let's talk about the investor perspective then. Clearly, if Neil talks about needing every electron, if you're going to get significant increases in generation capacity onto the US grid, that means deploying a lot of capital to make that happen. I was just out a couple of days ago on the West Coast talking to a lot of people in various types of low carbon energy, in particular wind and solar and storage. And something you heard from them quite a bit, well, they talked about sort of two kind of key trends. The good news for them is growing electricity demand and data centers and some of the other things that Neil identified driving that growth in demand. So it's fantastic for them. But then they also say there are various obstacles and difficulties being created by Congress and administration. Crucially, they would identify one, the big, beautiful bill and the changes to tax credits, in particular ending the tax credits for wind and solar, clearly creating problems for them. And also some of the new regulatory stuff we've seen coming out of the Department of the Interior, some of the new barriers and challenges being put in the way of wind development in particular. And so it's a kind of mixed picture for them. And certainly it's not kind of full steam ahead, all systems go. It's not disappearing, but investment in renewables and storage definitely is facing some challenges. How do you see it?
Yeah, absolutely, Ed. It's a good question. Firstly, I agree. Like a lot of people always say we're, talking about energy transition. And in my mind, we're talking more about energy expansion. Like if you look at US, we had a period of over a decade where power demand was flat. That is not the case and has not been the case for the last couple of years. And if you look at what's expected here from here to like 2030, there is like maybe a 2.5-ish, give or take. Different research outfits will put different numbers of power demand growth through the end of the decade. And 2.5 might not sound like much, but the US is such a big power denominator that when you look at the incremental amount of electrons that represents from here through the end of 2030, that is more electrons than most countries in Europe use today. And so if you just think about what does it take for the US to plug in like the amount of power that like more than what most single countries in Europe use today, that is a lot of investment. And as you said, that comes in the form of generation, that comes in the form of electrifying and fortifying the grid, on batteries, and sort of the whole landscape. And when you overlay a little bit like that need and, us wanting to make it happen, and if you want to win the AI race, if you want to increase data centers and connectivity and, enable all the great things that are to come around robots, self-driving cars, you're going to need that electricity. And when you look at policy and around it, as an investor, one of the hardest things is like the policy uncertainty. These infrastructure projects, you don't make decisions on a whim and turn it on and off within, days, months, weeks. Like they're multi-year planning processes to get an asset in place. And so when policy kind of changes quickly and abruptly, in short periods of time, it makes it really difficult to plan and deliver on those projects. And it kind of grinds things to a halt and significantly delay things. So first and foremost, I would say a little more stability and visibility on a longer term policy would be critical to really enable the sector and the infrastructure space to really kind of catch up and facilitate that energy expansion trend.
And so do you think if we had that stability, we could get a lot more investment than we're seeing now?
Yeah, absolutely. I think just when the rules are changing, like it's very hard to plan and kind of work around those. So I would say first and foremost, that stability would be the biggest enabler. From there, you could argue certain kinds of policies and, tax credits and whatnot that would facilitate things. Sure. But at the end of the day, look, I don't think there's a one solution fits all. As Neil said, I think it's a little bit of, if you're in the winter area, if you're in a sunny area, if you're in an area with land and an area with water and an area with gas, like the solutions are different. Like there's no silver bullet for it. And so you need a little bit of all of the above. And so, the industry can accommodate to whatever the policies are and find the biggest solution, but we kind of need that visibility and that certainty.
And do you think that, we're talking like private capital can really do this? Or do you think the federal government has to come in with capital? Is there a role where the federal government has to come in with capital, or you think it's a private capital matter? Like if the different states and everybody has stable regimes, the money will appear and the projects will appear?
Yeah, I think as long as there is that opportunity, like private capital will show up and, private capital can get it done. So I don't think there is a need or a dependency that government capital needs to make it happen. If government capital wants to play a role and participate, accelerate, like it can, but I don't think it needs to really.
I think the challenge for private capital is, to Cecilio's point, is that stability. And I'm going to speak very parochially here to my experience at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. I think FERC has been a really important beacon of stability in the space over the better course of the last decade or so, with a few notable exemptions that I've already taken culpability for. If you look at the differences between FERC and other agencies in the space, look at US EPA, for instance. EPA went one direction under the Obama administration, completely different direction under Trump 1.0, flip-flopped again under Biden, and now has whipsawed again under Trump 2.0. For folks like KKR, who are trying to deploy private capital, trying to pin those investments to the political pendulum swinging wildly back and forth, is maddening. The beauty of FERC, independent agency, 5 commissioners, no more than 3 that can be from one political party, each serving a staggered 5-year term, so you could theoretically outlast the president that appointed you. The point of that is that when it comes to something as significant as electricity and reliability, we don't want politics in it, and we want to create that investment certainty so that deployers of both government capital and private capital can have that certainty and stability. What I'm a little bit worried about, and again, I played a role in starting this, and now you can't put the genie back in the bottle. FERC's getting more and more politicized. And like the White House today has basically openly stated that they're going to take control of the commission. And my concern there is, even in areas where I actually am supportive of policies that the administration is pursuing, I don't like the long-term precedent it's setting. We're basically going to turn FERC into EPA, and suddenly that beacon of stability will be lost. And it'll be increasingly more and more difficult for the KKRs of the world to deploy capital with confidence because of the uncertainty in government.
And Neil, let me ask you, do you think that Order 1920, and for the audience, that's this order that tells the different big regional coordination agencies like a PJM, or, places where it's just a utility-centered system, that they have to do 20-year planning in 5-year increments. Have you seen that make a change now? Is that bringing a positive thing? I'd like to hear Cecilio's point of view on that as well. And would you urge the Trump administration to make sure that FERC stays the course on that?
Yeah, I was very public. I would have, had I been on the commission, I would have voted for 1920. Honestly, part of the reason I didn't undertake some of the reforms that ultimately were comprised in 1920 is because I wanted to do other things like FERC Order 2222, which removed barriers to entry for aggregated distributed energy resources. And it would have taken so much bandwidth to do transmission planning reform that I couldn't have done some of the other things I wanted to do. But I would have voted for 1920 had I been on the commission. Would I have drafted it exactly the way it ultimately came out? Probably not, but I think I could have gotten there. And that's back to my point about like having that necessary stability. What I worry about now, and to answer your question, I actually don't think 1920 is going to provide the certainty that we need to get the necessary investment to build this transmission that is absolutely essential. If we're going to win the AI race, we cannot possibly win it without building out this transmission? But these are really complicated questions, and they're hard. I'll just be honest with you. They're hard. When it comes to something like siting, I have had my state regulatory counterparts when I was at FERC tell me, well, Neil, we would love it if FERC would just overrule us and, run over us and approve this transmission line, because otherwise we can't get it approved in our community, but we don't want to say that out loud. We'll be eviscerated. And I'm sitting here like, I like to go on vacation. Like, what if I want to visit your community? Why are you going to put it on me to approve the transmission line? Cost allocation. Cost allocation is really, really tricky. When you think about who is going to pay for this transmission line, think you got state A that has a tremendous amount of renewable capacity. You have state C that has huge demand for this energy. What happens to state B in the middle and to ratepayers in state B? FERC, and I agree with them, made a determination that ratepayers in state B get a genuinely significant benefit in the form of alleviated transmission congestion, which is one of the biggest issues that we have on our grid today, and that they ought to pay some portion of this long-haul transmission line. As an academic exercise, that may seem like a totally defensible thing. From a real-world standpoint, going to ratepayers in state B and saying, you're going to benefit neither from the generation nor the consumption of the power. We're going to build a transmission line through your backyard that you don't want, and we're going to make you pay for part of it. That's really, really hard. And so FERC did the heavy lifting. Chairman Willie Phillips, building upon my former colleague Rich Glick, they did the heavy lifting. They got Republican Chairman Mark Christie's vote for it. This should be stable policy that will enable investment so that we can build out the grid of the future. But what I worry about now is you're talking about policies out there, sunsetting all regulations, going back and kind of revisiting policy. Who's going to deploy capital based on 1920 if they're not confident that 1920 will be kept in place? This is the type of uncertainty that I'm talking about that is a problem for both Republicans and Democrats. I'm not trying to be partisan there.
Okay, so I want to get into, though, a substantive part of the current administration's critique of a lot of what's going on in terms of energy policymaking, where essentially they're talking about wind and solar as having no value to the grid, or maybe even negative value because they undercut the economics of dispatchable generation. And you read, I'm sure, the paper that came out of the Department of Energy back in July, where they talked about trends in the electricity system at the moment that are pointing towards very steep increase in outages, in particular because of 100 gigawatts or so thereabouts of dispatchable generation, mostly coal, being retired, about 200 gigawatts of generation being added to the grid, of which only 20 gigawatts is natural gas, the great majority, 120 gigawatts or so, is solar, and so on. And the argument then is being made that actually this is going to make the grid weaker, as I say, and will lead to an increase in blackouts. And actually, if you stop that solar and wind being built, that actually is going to make the grid more resilient. Do you think there's anything in that?
Yeah, I want to start by one thing, and this is where I think we do, and why I like coming on programs like this podcast and speaking openly and candidly is I think we've got to get past, some of the top line narratives that people like to push out. So when that study was initially presented, folks dismissed it as this was done by a bunch of political hacks that don't know what they're doing, and this is they're trying to force a outcome that the administration prefers. And I'll tell you, I know the people that worked on this report. These are very serious people, and the questions they raise are absolutely legitimate. And so I just want to start there as the baseline, that we should take that report seriously and not so quickly dismiss it in the manner in which some people did. I do have I think some sense of components of where I agree with what they're trying to do. I understand, because I faced this myself during my tenure at the commission, that there are probably some plants that are under economic pressure to retire that are probably needed for resource adequacy to meet the coming surge in demand that we're about to face, that we probably need to keep online longer. And market proponents don't love that. But if the administration is going to use tactics like 202C to keep some of these plants on longer, I will note that some of the plants that were scheduled to be retired, that they utilized 202C to keep open, were ultimately dispatched in the middle of the heat wave we had this summer, which kind of validates the point that the report and DOE was trying to make.
And sorry, a footnote here, 202C is...
It is an emergency authority that through the Federal Power Act that can be utilized to keep a plant operational that was otherwise scheduled to be retired. Thank you for clarifying that. But I also think, again, in my view, coming back to the core point that we need every available electron, there are just realistic constraints that we've got to consider. Gas is basically sold out through 2032. Because of supply chain constraints, we probably can't get new gas turbines built before maybe 2029 at the earliest. I'm a big believer in nuclear energy. I want so bad for advanced nuclear to be successful, and I've worked very closely with KKR and looking at making potential investments in this space, but I remain concerned about the reality that some of these plants will be built on the time frame that we need. I keep coming back to my tattoo. It's solar plus storage with gas peakers. That is the quickest thing that we can get onto the grid in the coming years to meet this coming surge in demand. And I do think the DOE report did touch on that to some degree and gives, sort of like some base credentials for it. And so I got to defend DOE there. They didn't blush over some of these issues. Now, I do have my criticisms. I thought Secretary Wright made a comment the other day that I thought was absolutely absurd, which was basically if you wrapped the world in a solar panel, you would only get like 20% of generation. And that's just not even like remotely close to being accurate. I wish he hadn't done that because he's a smart guy. James Danley, the Deputy Secretary of Energy, was my former general counsel, my former commissioner for... These are smart people. They know better than that. I wish he hadn't said that because, again, it now colors this DOE report that otherwise was pretty reasonable.
So Cecilio, quickly, because, elephant in the room, the people who looked like they were geniuses were the people who stepped in and restarting 3 Mile Island or, talking to Holtec about Palisades. Because, there is sort of a timeline for SMRs. KKR has really been at the forefront of being at least in the conversation for some of these big infrastructure projects. Too risky? Risky? What have you put your money down in? What do you love and which would come to market?
Yeah, definitely a good question, Amy. So look, reality, as I said, like we look at sort of everything across the board and there's no silver bullet, right? Like as an example, you think about solar plus storage. That is an area that we are extremely bullish. We think it makes a lot of sense in a lot of areas, but not everywhere, right? And just to take an example, like if you're a desert southwest of the United States, right? There's a lot of land. It's a desert. It's very sunny. You don't have snow. So solar and storage is a pretty easy, quick to deploy, applicable solution, like pretty competitive on a time and cost basis. At the same time, you don't have a lot of gas. You don't have a lot of water. And so it's not straightforward to build gas plants, in that area. But, if you look at other areas, like if you look at wintry and very snowy, like Northeast, is solar going to be the most competitive solution there? Probably not.
Well, Vermont's doubling down though. They're doubling down. What do you think?
I mean, I think it depends, right? Like
a lot of people they say I talked to people in Vermont in the electricity industry. They say that they've eliminated the duck curve with the battery program, but that every now and then they get a price spike based on having to shovel the snow off of the panels.
It's hard to shovel snow off panels. These things are massive. But no, look, jokes aside, I think when I think about it, there's, energy security, energy affordability, and some reasonable environmental responsibility, right? And I think as you look at, the energy transition and the energy expansion, you're juggling some version of those characteristics, right? And so, on the energy security, there is something to be said about, do you put all your eggs in one basket? and you have one solution, and if there's an issue there, that's all you had? Or do you proactively kind of diversify to have some solar, have some batteries, have some gas, and like have some mix of different solutions that when you run different shocks through the system, they kind of diversify and kind of counterbalance each other, affordability. Again, like price is a big one, right? And so you go for solutions that kind of help plug into the system complementary and bring things on a cost-efficient basis. And environmental responsibility, like that is a thing. People live in those communities, they breathe the air, they use the water, they, sit next to whatever that plant is. And so they care about what's there and how it affects their community and the day-to-day life. And so you do have to balance all three. And so I think different states, different areas, do that in slightly different ways.
So you've got Bill Gates, was cutting a ribbon on geothermal the other day, right? The Pentagon saying they're going to try geothermal at bases. You've got a whole slew of people swirling around. Can private money ever go into nuclear? First of a kind seems like off the table, or am I wrong?
Yeah, look, it depends a little bit on the nature of the private money, right? Like I'd say for us, we're financial investors. We're not, builders of nuclear power plants or operators of nuclear plants. You wouldn't want me doing that. I wouldn't want to be the one doing that. But there's a lot of companies and power companies, IPPs, that have been doing and running nuclear fleets for a very long time, and they have the expertise, they have the track record, and they know what they're doing. So ultimately, when we look at nuclear opportunities, we seek to be, how can we be partners where we bring, our capital or resources or know-how in the areas that are complementary, but, we will lean on and partner with, folks that have that industry, that operational expertise, and can do that, in a responsible and appropriate way. And so a lot of the nuclear restarts, I think are a great thing, right? Like it is a way to bring back online capacity, into the country. I share Neil's view. And I mean, he said we've worked on some of the nuclear opportunities together. Like, when you kind of fast forward, nuclear has some ways to go to kind of grow and develop, but I do see how it could be an important part of the energy mix when we're looking, medium and longer term.
And so new build, then, that is something which potentially you could be interested in investing in.
Yeah. And look, to us specifically, like we're a little more like infrastructure capital. So we're less so on the kind of early side venture type risk. So for us specifically, it would be a little more on, operating, kind of restarting or whatnot. But, there's plenty of other private capital pools out there, that do some of those more earlier stage kind of nuclear facilities. And, we've seen that. There's a couple, public companies on the nuclear side that, are developing new technologies or starting first of a kind projects and have raised billions of dollars to go and do so. And similarly, there's, a number of private companies that have been backed by, wealthy investors, as well as private capital pools, and have raised significant money to do that. And I think the private sector wouldn't be doing that if they didn't thought that there was a role and an outlook where you could see SMRs being a real thing deployed commercially, in big scale.
And do you think the electricity trend's going to last long enough for that? I mean, I saw a report this week that some of these private wealthy capital is actually going into fusion now. And I thought, oh my God, that's like super optimistic. Like, do we think that the electricity trend, Neil, Cecilio, is like, it's not like for the next 3 years, it's like forever?
Yeah, look, my personal perspective is, electricity is kind of like the ultimate commodity, right? Like an electron is completely undistinguishable from one or another. But, it is a very important commodity. It fuels a lot of what we do, right? Like lights, elevators, transport, machines, devices, phones, cell phones, everything. And when you kind of see the trend, we only use more and more of it, right? And as you see data centers growing, as you see AI taking a bigger part in life, as you start looking at some of those autonomous vehicles that are already kind of driving around, some pilots started here in the city recently. My view is there's only going to be more and more. And of course, there's, some offset on efficiency. And we've seen that over time, in light bulbs, insulation, things getting more power efficient. But, at the same time, in my view, it's going to keep growing. It's going to keep growing for a while, and it's not going away anytime soon.
I mean, I think we do need to have a better handle on the nature of demand and the coming surge in demand. I thought it was notable earlier this year when the Chinese DeepSeek announcement came out, which in my view, I viewed with a great deal of skepticism. I thought it was propaganda designed to chill investment in AI deployment in the US. But it had a significant impact. If you look at the publicly traded independent power producers, all of their stocks tanked in the immediate aftermath of that simple press release from the Chinese Communist Party, because their projected growth was predicated on this idea that there was this coming huge surge in demand coming. And we really need to grasp that. I think part of it is those of us on the energy side, we need to learn a lot more about AI and vice versa. I am told, credibly, that the rule of thumb today is that a simple ChatGPT search takes about 10 times as much power as a simple Google search. But that's with today's AI. That with advanced AI, it'll be 1,000,000 times as much power. Well, what does that mean? And how do we deal with that? And can these AI data centers be more flexible? Can they find greater efficiencies? To Cecilio's point, can we utilize AI to maybe navigate the interconnection queue, right? Like right now, one of the huge things I wrestled with at FERC was our inability to do studies in a feasible amount of time that led to this huge buildup and backlog in the interconnection queue. Can AI help us better navigate the interconnection queue? I work with a company right now that uses satellite imagery and AI to do vegetation management to better enable the mitigation of wildfire risk. That's another positive implication that we can utilize AI. But there are going to be broader questions societally. I'm telling you, people are focused on workforce and what AI might mean for a changing workforce, and they're focused on climate. And will AI be a positive lever for our ability to mitigate carbon emissions, or is it going to drive demand through the roof to such a degree that it's going to lead to an increase in emissions? These are huge societal questions that we need to answer. I actually think it is very unfortunate that most of these monumental decisions are falling on energy market regulators, my poor former colleagues at FERC having to deal with data center co-location. This is such a monumentally significant issue that should not fall on these poor people and the staffs at the commission. We need global leadership to answer some of these questions.
So let me just say, cards on the table, piece coming out in the Wall Street Journal, looking at all across the academic world's work on whether the AI could reduce so much energy use for things like route optimization across the transportation sector, for identifying and getting in place green materials for buildings, having HVAC systems work effectively in buildings, that we might actually see more energy savings from the AI than the AI itself actually uses. So really interesting when you look at the actual research that people have already done. It's not as horrifying as kind of what we're like hearing in the popular domain about the evils and how AI is just going to crash us into climate change catastrophe.
I totally agree. I mean, when I look at the sources of power demand, I think some of the hardest ones to predict is really data centers and AI, right? And within data centers, you have the cloud use case, which is the biggest use case. And that is more predictable. It's had a growth trend and, people are using the cloud more and more. But AI, I can't help but to think about those videos that NVIDIA puts out. And every year they're here's our new chip. And it is a gazillion times more efficient than the one 5 years ago and 5 years ago. And so where does that kind of equation of people using more AI, but then compute getting much more efficient on the use of power, where does that even out is a very
Come to NYU on Thursday because NVIDIA will be here talking precisely about that.
Exactly. Listen out for this on a future episode of the Energy Gang. We have the head of energy at NVIDIA as one of our guests. So yeah, it's going to be very interesting to talk to them about that.
For his answer.
Absolutely. Now I should open it to the audience for questions. I think, do we have a mic on the floor? Yeah. So if anyone has got a question they'd like to ask, you want to raise your hand? Yeah, I see one over there.
Philip Ellison. Cecilio and all of you really have raised the issues about long-term vision and how to get something like 1920 graven into stone. Well, of course, a year ago we had the Loper-Bright decision, which ironically came out of a response to Chevron, an oil producer. So the question really is, isn't this an opportunity now for Congress to right the balance in terms of administrative state and executive branch agencies and public policy written into the law, that things like 1920 become a part of the law, and that we are required to have a long-term vision, if you will, a Magna Carta for energy?
Yeah, very interesting thought. I think this is one for you, Neil. Yeah.
I'm going to start with this one. And I have a fairly optimistic view on this, which I know is rare in this moment in time where people have really lost confidence in Congress's ability to get serious things done. The reason I like it, and you raise a significant point about Loper-Bright and the erosion of Chevron deference and really kind of removing some of the deference on executive branch agency authority. I used to joke around with my colleagues that I loathed Chevron deference when I was chairman of FERC, except when it came to my decisions. Then I wanted it. But I actually think, and I hope I'm not being Pollyannishly naive here, I think that AI, and in particular, we've been talking a lot about the energy component of AI. We haven't focused as much on the national security component of AI. Amy actually addressed this beautifully on the Political Climate podcast, which will also air next week, which I hope you will listen to, where she talked about AI and drones and the warfare implications of AI. I actually am totally bought in on the need to win the AI race against the Chinese Communist Party for national security purposes, with an understanding that in order to do so, we're going to need a tremendous amount of energy to win it. And I'm hoping that that will be the trigger that enables Congress to bust out of the sort of partisan corners that we've been locked into when it comes to energy. I would have thought and hoped that a reliability event, having been a former reliability regulator, would have been the thing that would have shaken us out of our partisan corners. It didn't happen. I would have hoped, as somebody who oversaw the competitive wholesale power markets, that huge surges in prices would lead us to break out of our political corners. Didn't happen either. You know what I sadly think it's going to take? The minute one of these big AI data centers that was projected to be built in PJM or ERCOT or MISO goes to Alberta where they have surplus capacity, or overseas to South Korea, Freudian slip, Japan, China, that is, I think, what is going to awaken policymakers in America, that we gotta bust out of this partisan logjam that we've sort of been locked into for the last kind of couple of decades. We haven't had a major energy bill done really since the Energy Policy Act of 2005. You look at everything subsequent to then, most energy policy has been done vis-a-vis the tax code or budget reconciliation, which is not stable. We need real bipartisan, like set in stone Magna Carta energy policy. And I'm hoping that we get there before it's like reactionary. I would like to be proactive and get there. I am optimistic that you are starting to see some bipartisan conversations amongst Republicans and Democrats who really don't necessarily see eye to eye on policy, talking about the need for permitting reform. That's a great place to start. I think permitting reform could be the fantastic basis for that larger energy policy. So I'm going to go ahead and choose to view the optimistic camp that we can get there, because we need to get there.
Thanks. Another question. Yeah, one down here in the front.
Thank you. Suhail Shter, I'm a research energy at the McKinsey Global Institute. We speak a lot about the AI, need for energy, and it is a very interesting question. But AI's energy use now is quite a small energy bucket compared to these other end uses. We talk about electrifying road transport, all these other things that it's not 10% of the energy system. It would be of the electricity. It's going to be 2x or 3x. If we're having so much trouble now getting the electricity we need for AI, What does that mean for these other goals? How realistic can we actually be in terms of this transition? And what does it mean that China is doing this so much faster than us in the US?
So let me take that on for a second. So I think, and Cecilia has already sort of made this point that a lot of things are locational specific, but I think one of the challenges of AI and inference and some of the other applications within the AI, calculation algorithm process is that it can cause a sudden surge or sudden change in electricity demand in a sort of, I don't want to say moment to moment, but in a less predictable manner. And that's a challenge not only for our grid, but for China's grid. I mean, coal cannot go flexing up and down. And so thinking about how to take this old system that was built, was 100 years ago or more?
5 more.
Yeah, and you're going to try to get it to address this new kind of usage. It's, especially in commodity prices where you're having a capacity market, prices are, we all have this expression in economics, prices are set at the margin. So that little 1% problem, we saw that take down all the electricity of Spain, right? I mean, that little problem can be a really, really big problem. And to Neil's point, and this is really fundamental because as a person who's been struggling to really understand all of this, who in Congress really understands about maintaining frequency and voltage? Does anybody in Congress know
Sean
about...
Casten.
Okay. Does anybody know about spinning? Like, it's the education curve is also, very steep. And so we really do need to actually take politics out of it. And really, it's like, there are many areas where we really should let technical experts weigh in. That could take, the whole rest of the day to talk about that. But in electricity, where making a mistake means none of us have service, it really is important to understand how the grid is going to have to respond to new kinds of conditions and what are the ways of achieving that. We haven't talked about, here's a fancy word, reconductoring, right? Do we take the copper out and put some more high-grade material that's less apt to heat? I don't know if that's an investable space for outside capital or whether that has to be utility. Getting utilities to see, Neil, that that's a safe technology, even though it's been around for a long time. These things are challenges that an electricity-specific bill on the Hill could be really helpful.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think you raised a great point, which is like, what is the actual share of electricity that AI is taking? And it's small. Like when I think about kind of the power demand, data centers are less than half. And of that, the majority of it is cloud. And you have more visibility. AI is a small percentage of that. And it's going to get more and more important, but it doesn't make or break the story. It is like addition and incremental to the already backbone of growth that you see. When you kind of take a step back outside data centers and AI, the majority of power demand is just coming from good old commercial, industrial demand, additional residential development, the Internet of Things, people having more widgets and gadgets. And like all those things are pretty strong, secular trend lines. Like, developers don't stop building a residential community because, like power is going to be 10% more expensive or 20% more expensive in order to get the power to actually build the commercial development or the residential development. You don't stop buying a second phone or an iPad, just because, my power bill or my access to power, right? Like people just move forward with this.
It is the case, isn't it, that power demand in the United States was basically flat for 20 years or so, from kind of 2000, maybe 15 is more accurate, but let's say 2007, 8 through to the early 2020s. And now it is taking off. Now it is actually moving. And so I think it's worth thinking about that as being a significantly different thing that's happening, a significantly new development. And I think in terms of that incremental one, as you say, within data centers, there are a lot of other things that people use data centers for, not just AI. But I think there's something out there, right? The world is definitely changing.
Yeah, totally. It's like I said at the beginning, in my view, we are in an era of energy expansion, right? So
time for another question, I think. We might have time for one or two. Oh, yeah, one down the front here. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'm Anne-Catherine Mertz. I'm with First Ammonia. As we're talking about resiliency, I also wanted to ask you to comment about onshore and offshore wind. So it's clear that there's a consensus that solar plus batteries has been really effective as a low-cost, fast solution. We're seeing in ERCOT in Texas that we're getting much better at managing the spikes. But when we look at energy, of course, the time that energy is available is very significant. And here, onshore wind, when we look at Texas, you get wind at night. That's a huge advantage. And then when we look at offshore wind, with offshore, you get even higher capacity factors at different hours of the day, again, uncorrelated. And so I'm curious what you see the path forward for wind in the United States, given that it has become very political, and I know we're weary about the politicization of these topics, but particularly when we look at onshore wind, it becoming so political has become a question mark for investment decisions. What does it mean if a president does not like a specific technology? And then also in terms of our allies, we're thinking many of these technologies are coming from European energy companies and potentially threatening their investments, then also hurts their energy industries. So I'm curious, this is a delicate topic, but what you see as a role for onshore and offshore wind in the United States, if any, or is the future really, thinking of your tattoo, Neil, is the future really solar, batteries, and gas?
Offshore wind, like you say, is a much steadier source even of asset. It's definitely moving forward in other places and providing good measure to the grid. It was very challenged in the United States to start with because with the interest rates being high and some of the other supply chain issues with putting together such a big mega project, people were having to renegotiate terms as it was. And so I think it was sort of vulnerable already, and therefore it's not clear how much of some of it, of course, you're stopping a project that's already being built. That's a totally different story. Hopefully they'll reissue the permit for that. But understanding all the different variables, what I would just say is, especially when you're doing giant infrastructure, and that goes to nuclear, right? And that goes to offshore wind. We have to absolutely get the technology right. I grew up in Boston, so what happened in Nantucket was really quite frightening. And it looks
I'm
like—
sorry, when you say what happened in Nantucket?
I mean, there was this giant explosion of an offshore wind turbine. And it was touch and go for a couple of weeks about whether or not— I mean, it seems like everything's been worked out, but it was very dangerous in the first couple of days. I would liken it to sort of a Texas oil spill in its impact on the beaches in Nantucket. And we need to know, and it turned out there were some things that are now going to be fixed, but we need to know. It wasn't the first time that it happened. It's happened in other countries. And so we really need to know and make sure that everything is being done exactly correctly. It's an engineering thing. That's what I said about electricity, right? We need to take the politics out of all of this stuff, and we need to go with knowing that there's a regular process that's going to make sure that everything that gets built safely, not because it's a pet of one person versus the pet of another person, or that somebody's politically connected or not politically connected. And that goes for all of these technologies across the board. And so, I think that is really what I would say about offshore wind. Are we sure that every installation is going in properly? And then I would add to that, since we're not mentioning it all, you're talking about, Europe or New England or whatever. I mean, hydro, is yet another, untalked about resource. But when you're talking about data centers, you mentioned Canada, are they going to go to places that have hydro, right? Because, that's also like a really promising source for something like a data center, and it has some flexibility to go up and down. Now, let me just tell a 2-second anecdotal story, because I know we're getting out of time. But I went to Europe this summer, and to get a much cheaper airfare, I went to Iceland. And, they have these programs where you could get out of the plane and, do a little sightseeing in Iceland, and then you go on to your destination. So my husband and I did that. And as we were driving past the geothermal plant that Iceland uses for all its hot water and electricity, the driver was explaining to us that this very dark brown and black soil that was around this area that had the geothermal plant was lava. And I started asking him, because I'm an energy expert, I started asking him questions about it because, that seemed like pretty risky to me. Like, what if the lava hit the plant? And he admitted to me that the lava had knocked off the major hot water pipeline from that plant, and people had no hot water in Iceland for several weeks. Maybe it was several days, I forget now. Anyway, my point is, all of these facilities, have risks associated with them. And how we think about how to mitigate those risks, it doesn't mean you shouldn't do geothermal in Iceland. It doesn't mean we shouldn't do offshore wind. It just means that we need to make sure that in the process, and I understand, speed, and so forth, we still have to have responsible human beings who know something about technology, who are going to actually look at the safety of all the things we use, from oil and gas to coal, across the entire spectrum.
If I could just very quickly on offshore wind, and it kind of ties into a point I made earlier in the conversation about the politicization of all this wonky technical policy. In October of 2020, when I was the Trump-appointed Republican chair of FERC, I led a technical conference at the Commission on offshore wind integration, because this was one of the nuanced complexities that we needed to solve before we could move forward on it. This is the kind of record that independent agencies like FERC build that stay in place forever, that don't, or at least aren't supposed to flip and flop back and forth between different administrations. And that's where, to the earlier question about Loper Bright and Chevron deference and the importance of these agencies, I want to take a moment to plug the importance of these critical agencies, because there was nothing political about this offshore wind interconnection technical conference. It was the nerdiest thing in the world. I'm certain maybe you were one of the only people that even understood what we talked about at it. But that record is critical for us to build upon to make progress in the future. And that's why we need these things.
Yeah, that is a great point. And it's been fantastic talking to you all. Really great conversation. Unfortunately, we do have to leave it there, though. But thanks very much indeed, Neil. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Cecilio. Great talking to you all. Thanks very much to our producers, Toby Biggins-Gilchrist and Dan Cottrell. Thanks very much to the Council on Foreign Relations for hosting us in this fantastic venue. And above all, thanks very much to all of you for listening. Thanks to everyone who's listening at home on the podcast, wherever you may be. Thanks to everyone who's been listening in the room as well. And we'll be back very soon with all the latest news and views on the future of energy. Until then, goodbye.